In the darkness, when everything around was swallowed by shadow, a strange sound broke through, sharp, piercing, as if something massive and heavy was tearing through the earth. John stood by the window, his heart tightening in fear as he saw a figure slowly, eerily emerge from the forest. The moose, which had vanished before, now stood mere feet from the house, its eyes glowing in the dark like two mirrors filled with something inhuman. And then, in that chilling silence, the doorbell rang. John hesitated to open, but it felt as though someone was standing in the dark, their breath growing louder and louder, as if it was right behind him. Chapter 1. An ordinary day that changed forever. The morning on John and Emma's farm began like any other. The soft golden light of dawn stretched across the fields, casting long shadows as the couple emerged from their cozy farmhouse. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of hay and damp soil. John, a man of steady habits, stretched his back before heading toward the barn. Emma, wrapped in a thick knitted cardigan, took a deep breath of the fresh morning air before making her way to the chicken coop. The animals were already stirring, their sounds blending into a familiar morning symphony. Clucking hens, the occasional lowing of the cows, and the impatient honks of the geese demanding their breakfast. John started his routine with the cows, stroking their thick hides before filling their troughs with fresh hay. "Easy there, Bella," he murmured as one of the cows nudged his arm. Meanwhile, Emma scattered grain for the chickens, watching with amusement as they fluttered around her feet. Everything was just as it should be, or so they thought. The geese stir up trouble. Just as Emma finished with the chickens, a commotion erupted near the pond. The geese, usually loud and opinionated, had launched into a full-blown riot. Feathers flew, wings flapped violently, and their sharp honks filled the air with an unusual intensity. Emma frowned, wiping her hands on her apron. "Something's got them riled up," she muttered. She hurried toward the pond, expecting to find a fox or perhaps a stray dog lurking nearby. John, hearing the noise, set down the pitchfork he had been using and followed her. "What's all the fuss about?" he asked, squinting toward the geese. The birds had formed a chaotic cluster, flapping their wings aggressively at something near the fence line. Emma approached cautiously, her eyes scanning the ground for any signs of a predator. But there was nothing, just an eerie tension in the air, as if something unseen had passed through moments before. Then she saw it, the mysterious tracks. "John," Emma called out, her voice tinged with unease. She crouched near the fence, pointing to a set of deep, fresh tracks imprinted in the damp soil. They were large, too large for a dog, too round for a deer. John knelt beside her, running a calloused hand over the prints. He frowned. "These ain't dog tracks, that's for sure." Emma glanced around nervously. "A bear?" she whispered. John shook his head. "No claw marks, and bears don't usually wander this far into the village." The geese continued their angry protest, their beady eyes fixed on the trees beyond the fence. The early morning air, once calm and inviting, now felt charged with an unfamiliar energy. "We should check the perimeter," John said, rising to his feet. "Something was here last night, and it wasn't small." Emma nodded, but before they could move, the farm dogs, two sturdy mutts named Rusty and Duke, came barreling around the corner of the barn, their noses to the ground, tails rigid. They sniffed the air, then let out a low growl. Something was wrong, a shift in the air. Emma had always trusted the instincts of their dogs. They were gentle but fiercely protective, and right now they were on high alert. Rusty sniffed the fence post where the tracks led off into the woods, then whined, his ears flattened against his head. Duke, the braver of the two, let out a sharp bark and took a few steps forward, his stance rigid. John exhaled sharply. "I don't like this." Emma wrapped her arms around herself. Maybe it was just a passing animal. John didn't look convinced. He patted Duke's head, trying to reassure the dog as much as himself. "Let's keep an eye out. If something's lurking around here, we'll know soon enough." They turned back toward the barn, but Rusty and Duke didn't follow. The dogs remained by the fence, staring into the forest as if waiting for something to return. The moose appears. The morning routine continued, albeit with an underlying sense of unease. By mid-morning, Emma was in the kitchen preparing tea while John checked on the rabbits. The earlier disturbance still weighed on their minds, but they had a farm to run, and work waited for no one. Then it happened. A thunderous crash shattered the quiet. John spun around just in time to see the barn doors slam open as a massive, panicked shape barreled through the yard. Emma dropped her teacup, the porcelain shattering on the wooden floor. A full-grown moose had entered their farm. It was enormous, its antlers spanning wide like the branches of a great oak. Its eyes were wild with fear, its breath coming in heavy bursts, and it was charging straight toward the chicken coop. John acted on instinct. He grabbed the nearest shovel and ran toward the beast, shouting to drive it away. Emma, still frozen in shock, watched as the geese took flight in every direction, the chickens scattering in blind panic. Rusty and Duke erupted into action, barking furiously, trying to corral the animal. But the moose was too terrified to be controlled. It pivoted sharply, its hooves digging deep into the soil, and changed direction, straight toward the cows. Emma gasped, "John, the cows!" But before he could react, the moose lowered its head and charged forward. The next moment was a blur of movement, noise, and chaos. Chapter 2. Panic on the farm. The farmyard exploded into chaos. The massive moose, confused and terrified, darted wildly from one side of the yard to the other. Its powerful hooves pounded the ground, kicking up dirt and straw as it swerved, nearly knocking over a wooden feed trough. The animals, already unsettled, erupted into a frenzy, a stampede of fear. The cows were the first to panic. With their heavy bodies and strong legs, they weren't the easiest creatures to frighten, but the sight of the moose charging straight toward them sent them into sheer terror. Bella, the oldest and calmest of the herd, let out a deep, distressed bellow before turning and bolting toward the open gate. The others followed. John's heart lurched as he saw them rushing toward the fence. If they broke through, rounding them up again would be a nightmare. "Emma, the cows!" he shouted, already running toward the gate, waving his arms to try and redirect them. Emma was right behind him, her face pale with shock. "Close the gate!" she cried, but it was too late. The cows, blinded by fear, crashed into the wooden posts. The fence held barely, but the impact caused the top plank to splinter. One particularly frantic cow managed to squeeze through, her hooves skidding on the frosty grass as she bolted toward the field beyond. John swore under his breath, "We'll have to get her later. Right now, we need to." A deafening honk cut him off. Geese in revolt. The geese, already rattled from the morning's disturbance, had reached their breaking point. Unlike the cows, they weren't interested in running. They were preparing for war. With loud, furious honks, they spread their wings and launched themselves toward the moose, flapping and pecking with all the rage their small bodies could muster. It was a ridiculous sight. Half a dozen white birds charging at a massive wild animal. But the moose, startled by the sudden assault, reared back. For a brief moment, John thought the tactic might actually work. But then the moose, overwhelmed and out of options, spun sharply in the other direction, straight toward the farmhouse. The dogs fight back. Rusty and Duke were already on high alert. They had been barking furiously since the moment the moose appeared. But now, seeing the chaos unfold, they sprang into action. Rusty, the braver of the two, lunged forward first, his sharp bark echoing through the yard. Duke followed, snapping at the moose's heels, trying to drive it away from the house. "Careful, boys," Emma called out, her hands gripping the wooden railing of the porch. But Rusty was too focused to hear her. The moose, startled by the sudden attack from below, kicked out wildly. And then, a sharp, heart-stopping yelp filled the air. A cry of pain. John's stomach dropped as he saw Rusty collapse onto the ground, his side grazed by the moose's powerful antlers. The dog whimpered, struggling to get up, but his back leg wouldn't support him. Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Rusty!" The moose, still frantic, barely registered what had happened. It swerved again, finally making its way toward the open gate and disappearing into the trees beyond the farm. But no one was watching the moose anymore. John and Emma ran to Rusty's side, their hearts pounding. The usually strong and energetic dog lay trembling, his breath coming in short gasps. Duke circled anxiously, whining as he nudged his fallen companion. John knelt down, his hands moving quickly over Rusty's fur. His side was bleeding, a deep gash but not fatal. "We need to get him inside," John said, his voice tight with worry. Emma nodded, her eyes glistening. "I'll get the towels. And the antiseptic." As she rushed inside, John carefully lifted Rusty into his arms. The dog let out a soft whimper but didn't struggle. The moose was gone. The cows were scattered. The farm was in complete disarray. And now their loyal friend was hurt. John took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was far from over. Chapter 3. Saving the dog. The chaos had left the farm in disarray. Feathers and clumps of hay scattered across the yard. The cows stood anxiously at the far end of their enclosure, and Duke paced restlessly near the porch, his eyes locked on Rusty, who lay motionless in John's arms. Emma rushed back from the house, her hands full of supplies. Clean towels, a bottle of antiseptic, and a bowl of warm water. "Lay him down here," she said, her voice firm but trembling. John carefully placed Rusty on the porch, his own hands still shaking. First aid in extreme conditions. Rusty whimpered as Emma pressed a towel against the wound. Blood had matted his fur, and though the injury wasn't fatal, it was deep enough to cause concern. "We have to stop the bleeding," Emma murmured, gently parting the dog's fur. John held Rusty steady while she poured antiseptic over the wound. The dog tensed, letting out a sharp whine. "I know, boy, I know," John soothed, stroking Rusty's head. "You're a tough one." Duke whimpered nearby, watching with wide, worried eyes. He nudged Emma's arm, as if asking if his friend would be okay. Emma's hands worked quickly. She pressed a clean bandage against Rusty's side, then wrapped it securely with strips of cloth. "We'll have to keep an eye on it. If it gets infected—" She didn't finish the sentence. John exhaled heavily. "Let's get him inside. He needs rest." Carefully, they carried Rusty into the house, laying him on an old blanket near the fireplace. The dog let out a tired sigh and closed his eyes, calming the farm after the storm. Outside, the farm still buzzed with tension. The cows, though still jumpy, had begun to settle. Emma moved between them, speaking softly, stroking their flanks, offering them fresh hay. She knew the animals needed reassurance as much as she did. The geese, on the other hand, remained irritable. They honked angrily, marching around the yard as if preparing to file an official complaint. The chickens, still ruffled from the chaos, refused to leave their coop. John sighed, rubbing his temples. "It'll take days for them to calm down." Emma chuckled, though the sound was weak. "We'll manage. We always do." But they weren't out of trouble yet. The moose problem. John grabbed a sturdy wooden pole and stepped cautiously toward the barn. The moose was still there, pacing nervously near the fence, trapped between the chicken coop and the old tool shed. "Easy now," John muttered, assessing the situation. The massive animal snorted, its wild eyes darting around for an escape. John had dealt with stubborn animals before. Cows that refused to be milked, pigs that wouldn't go back into their pens. But this was something entirely different. "John," Emma called from the porch. "Be careful." He gave her a quick nod before taking another step forward. Cornered and dangerous. The moose was breathing heavily, its nostrils flaring. It was scared, and scared animals made unpredictable choices. John didn't want to frighten it further, but it needed to leave. He tapped the wooden pole against the ground, trying to guide it toward the open gate. "Go on now," he coaxed. "No reason to stay." The moose hesitated, ears twitching. For a moment, John thought it might work. Then, something shifted in the animal's stance. It lowered its head slightly, its muscles tensing. John froze. In that brief moment, he realized the moose wasn't trying to leave. felt trapped. And if it decided to charge? A sleepless night and an unexpected call. John took a slow step back, not daring to turn his back on the animal. His heart pounded as he reached the porch. "We can't force it out," he said, closing the door behind him. "We'll have to wait." Emma sighed, looking at Rusty, who lay curled up on the blanket, his breathing steady but shallow. "And what if it doesn't leave?" John didn't have an answer. They spent the evening tending to Rusty, checking his wound, and trying to keep Duke from panicking. Outside, the moose remained, its massive silhouette barely visible in the dim lantern light. Neither John nor Emma got much sleep that night. Every creak, every rustle outside made them flinch. Then, just past midnight, the phone rang. John grabbed the receiver, his voice hoarse. "Hello!" A familiar voice crackled on the other end. "John, it's Bill. I heard about the moose. Need some help." John let out a slow breath. Help had arrived. Chapter 4, A Difficult Decision. The night was long, restless, and filled with the sounds of an uneasy farm. The moose remained near the barn, pacing occasionally, its heavy hooves crunching the frost-covered grass. Inside the house, Rusty whimpered in his sleep, his body still weak from the injury. Duke refused to leave his side, curling up next to him as if guarding him from the night itself. John sat in his armchair, staring out the window. His hands were wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Emma, sitting beside him, rubbed her temples. Neither of them had truly slept. Then, just before dawn, the rumble of a truck broke the uneasy silence. Help arrives. John stepped outside, squinting against the dim morning light as the headlights of the old pickup truck flickered off. Bill, their longtime neighbor and an experienced forester, climbed out, adjusting his heavy coat. "Morning," he said, nodding toward John. His sharp eyes scanned the farmyard. "He's still here." John motioned toward the barn. "Hasn't moved much since last night. Won't leave, but won't charge either." Bill sighed, running a hand over his stubbled chin. "He's scared. Probably lost his way and doesn't know where to go." Emma appeared at the door, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "What do we do?" Bill adjusted his hat. "We've got two options. We either wait him out, let him leave on his own, or we drive him out." John frowned. "And if he panics?" Bill didn't answer immediately. He looked at the barn, then at the house. "Let's hope he doesn't." Soothing the farm. While Bill assessed the situation, Emma focused on the other animals. The cows, still shaken from their late-night panic, refused to leave the far side of their enclosure. Even the geese, usually the most fearless creatures on the farm, stayed clustered near the pond, honking in low, wary tones. Emma moved among them, speaking softly, offering hay and grain, running a hand over their trembling sides. Animals could sense tension, and right now the entire farm was on edge. John joined her, gently stroking Bella's muzzle. "They'll calm down eventually." Emma nodded. "I just hate seeing them like this." Another moose? As the sun rose, Bill returned from scouting the woods. His expression was grim. "You're not gonna like this," he said, crossing his arms. "Spotted tracks near the edge of the property. Looks like another moose was wandering around last night. Could be his mate, could be a young one looking for shelter." Emma's face paled. "Another one?" Bill shrugged. "Could have already moved on. But if they're lingering here, there's a reason." John exchanged a worried glance with Emma. They'd never dealt with moose on the farm before. A stray deer, sure. A wandering fox, sometimes. But two moose? "Let's deal with the one we've got first," John said firmly. "Then we'll worry about the rest." A home for Rusty. Back inside, Rusty stirred weakly on his blanket. His eyes flickered open, meeting Emma's with a tired gaze. She knelt beside him, stroking his head. "Hey there, sweetheart. You're safe." Duke wagged his tail excitedly, nudging Rusty's face as if to say, "Get up already." John watched for a moment before letting out a deep sigh. "He can't stay outside anymore." Emma looked up. "What do you mean?" John leaned against the table. Rusty's getting older. He's been our best farm dog for years. But after this, I don't think he should be sleeping out in the barn anymore. It's too cold. And if he gets injured again..." Emma's eyes softened. "You're saying we should keep him in the house?" John hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." Emma smiled. "I think he'd like that." Rusty, as if understanding the decision, gave a small, contented sigh and rested his head on Emma's lap. A new problem. Just as they began to feel a moment of relief, the house suddenly fell silent. Too silent. The refrigerator stopped humming. The old clock on the wall froze mid-tick. The dim light bulb above the table flickered once, then went dark. John and Emma looked at each other. "The power's out," Emma said. John rubbed his face, exhaustion hitting him all at once. "Of course it is." From outside, Bill's voice rang out. "You're not gonna like this either." John groaned. "What now?" Bill pointed toward the road. "Just heard on the radio, there was an accident at the village power station. Whole town's without electricity." Emma sighed. "And let me guess. No idea when it'll be back?" Bill shook his head. "Could be hours. Could be days." John exhaled slowly, glancing at the farm. No power meant no heated water, no working fridge, and no lights in the barn. And in the middle of it all, they still had a trapped moose to deal with. "Well," he muttered, rolling up his sleeves, "guess we better get to work." Chapter 5: Village Blackout. The morning air carried an eerie stillness, broken only by the restless shuffling of animals in their enclosures. The lack of humming from the old refrigerator, the absence of the usual mechanical sounds from the barn, it all felt wrong. John stood on the porch, staring toward the village. Even from here, he could tell the blackout wasn't just their problem. The whole town had gone dark. No distant glow from streetlights, no faint hum of life from neighboring farms. Just silence. Emma emerged from the house, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. "Bill just left. Said they're working on fixing the power station, but no one knows how long it'll take." John sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Could be hours. Could be days." Emma glanced at the barn. "We need to check on the animals." John nodded. "And figure out how we're going to run this farm without electricity. Milking the cows the old-fashioned way." The barn was unusually dim, with only thin rays of morning sunlight filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls. The cows were unsettled, shifting nervously in their stalls, as if sensing that something was off. Emma ran a hand over Bella's side, whispering soft reassurances. "It's okay, girl. Just a little hiccup." John, however, was focused on a more immediate problem. The milking machine, their trusty helper for years, stood useless without power. "We're gonna have to do this the old way," he muttered, rolling up his sleeves. Emma raised an eyebrow. "When's the last time you hand-milked a cow?" John let out a chuckle. "Been a while." As they worked, the rhythmic sound of milk hitting the metal pail filled the barn. It was slower, messier, but strangely comforting. The cows, though initially wary, seemed to settle under the familiar human touch. Emma wiped her brow. "Well, at least we won't run out of milk." John stretched his sore hands. "Yeah, but let's hope this blackout doesn't last too long. My arms might not survive." Finding light in the darkness. Back at the house, Emma rummaged through an old storage chest, pulling out candle stubs, an old oil lamp, and a half-forgotten flashlight. John frowned at the dim glow of the flashlight. "Batteries are weak." Emma lit the oil lamp, its flickering glow casting long shadows on the kitchen walls. "We'll have to make do." John rubbed his chin. "The old generator. Think it still works?" Emma gave him a skeptical look. "That thing hasn't been used in years. It's probably rusted solid." John shrugged. "Only one way to find out." After an hour of pulling, prodding, and muttered curses, the generator coughed, sputtered, and finally roared to life, if barely. The dim bulbs in the house flickered weakly. It wasn't much, but it was something. Emma placed a hand on John's shoulder. "That should keep the fridge running, at least for now." John exhaled. One problem solved. Now what about Rusty? No vet, no help. Rusty was curled up near the fireplace, his tail twitching in his sleep. The bandage on his side was still clean, but Emma knew the wound needed professional attention. She picked up the phone and dialed the local vet. Nothing, not even a ringing tone. She tried again, then again. John, watching her frustration, spoke quietly. No power means no working landlines. Emma clenched her fists. Cell towers must be down too. They were on their own. She knelt beside Rusty, gently checking his wound. It wasn't bleeding anymore, but there was swelling around the stitches. Infection. John handed her a small bottle. Whiskey. Emma raised an eyebrow. You want me to drink while treating him? John smirked. It's for disinfecting, unless you need a sip for courage. Emma sighed, dipping a cloth into the strong liquid before dabbing Rusty's wound. The dog whimpered but didn't move. We'll have to keep a close eye on him, she said. If this gets worse. John didn't let her finish. They both knew how dangerous untreated infections could be. A stranger in the dark. The evening crept in, the farm bathed in flickering lamplight. The moose, still lurking near the barn, had finally stopped pacing, but it hadn't left. John sat at the table, listening to the quiet crackling of the fire. Strange day, Emma sighed. And it's not over yet. Just then, Duke let out a low, warning growl. John stiffened. What is it, boy? Duke stood at the front door, his ears perked. A shadow moved outside the window. Emma grabbed John's arm. Did Bill say he was coming back? John shook his head slowly. A soft knock echoed through the dark house. Chapter 6. Secrets of the Night. The knock was soft but deliberate. In the dim light of the oil lamp, John and Emma exchanged a wary glance. Duke stood rigid, his low growl vibrating through the wooden floor. John reached for the shotgun by the door, not out of fear but out of habit. Living on a farm far from immediate help meant being prepared. Who's there? He called. A pause, then a voice, rough and tired. It's Sam. Open up. John hesitated for only a moment before unlocking the door. Standing on the porch, covered in dirt and sweat, was Sam Becker, a mechanic from the village. His face was drawn with exhaustion, and his jacket was streaked with soot. Emma stepped forward. Sam? What's wrong? Sam exhaled heavily. You folks need to be careful tonight. Things are worse than we thought. A dangerous journey. As they sat at the kitchen table, Sam explained. The power station didn't just fail, he said. It caught fire. Emma gasped. A fire? Sam nodded. We tried to put it out, but we didn't have enough water pressure. Some of the lines are down, too. The whole town is in the dark, and it's going to stay that way for a while. John leaned back in his chair. How long? Sam shook his head. Days, maybe a week. Hard to say. Emma bit her lip. We've got a sick dog. We need the vet. Sam hesitated. I ran into Dr. Mitchell before I came here. Phone's out. Roads are blocked. But he said he'd come. Emma's eyes widened. Through the woods. Sam nodded. Said he had no other choice. John muttered under his breath. The woods were dense, and at night they weren't safe. Not with wild animals stirred up by the fire. Not with a panicked moose still loose on their farm. Emma folded her arms. We should meet him halfway. John frowned but didn't argue. All right, let me get my coat. A town in crisis. As John prepared to leave, Emma grabbed the oil lamp and followed Sam outside. From the edge of the porch, she could see a faint orange glow in the distance. Farther than the village, but still too close for comfort. The fire's spreading, Sam murmured. Emma felt a chill crawl up her spine. If it reaches the fields. Sam didn't finish the sentence. They both knew. No electricity meant no pumps, no way to quickly contain a wildfire. If the wind shifted in the wrong direction, the entire countryside could be in danger. A farm in the dark. John returned, shotgun slung over his shoulder. If we're leaving, we need to make sure the farm is secure. Emma nodded. The geese were restless, huddled together by the pond. The cows had retreated to the farthest corner of their enclosure. The moose was still there, lurking in the shadows near the barn. Emma clenched her fists. "We can't leave them like this." John handed her a lantern. "We're not leaving them unprotected. But the vet is coming for Rusty, and we can't let him wander in blind." Emma hesitated, then nodded. "We'll be quick." A cry in the darkness. As they set out toward the woods, the night was eerily silent. Even the usual sounds of the farm had faded into uneasy stillness. Then, from behind the barn, a sudden, piercing scream. Not human, not the moose, something else. Duke took off running, barking furiously. John and Emma spun around. The animals in the barn erupted into chaos, their fear echoing into the night. Something was out there, and it wasn't alone. Chapter 7, Hope for Help. The night was thick with tension, the air heavy and cold. Every creak of the wooden farmhouse, every rustle of wind through the bare trees felt louder, sharper, as though the darkness itself held its breath. John and Emma stood frozen, the distant, unearthly scream still ringing in their ears. The animals in the barn were in a frenzy, cows bellowing, geese honking, and Duke's frantic barking cutting through the chaos. "We can't leave them like this," Emma whispered, clutching John's arm. John's grip on the shotgun tightened. "I know." But before they could decide whether to investigate, the distant outline of a figure emerged at the edge of the forest, a faint beam of light bobbing with each step. "The vet," John murmured, both relieved and anxious. An unexpected welcome. Dr. Mitchell stumbled into the yard, flashlight in hand, sweat glistening on his forehead despite the cold. He was a middle-aged man with a kind but weathered face, now drawn tight with exhaustion. "Thank God," Emma breathed, hurrying to meet him. "You came." The vet nodded, bending over to catch his breath. "Had no choice. Couldn't leave your dog to suffer." But before he could take another step, his flashlight beam swept across the yard and froze on the looming shape of the moose, still standing near the barn. "Jesus," Dr. Mitchell whispered. John raised a hand, signaling him to stay calm. "He's been here all night. Won't leave. Just watching." The moose, half hidden in the shadows, snorted, its breath visible in the cold air. Its massive antlers looked almost surreal in the dim light. Dr. Mitchell swallowed hard. "That's not normal." Emma glanced at John, fear flickering in her eyes. "Why is he still here?" John didn't have an answer. Rusty's condition worsens. They quickly ushered Dr. Mitchell inside, where Rusty lay by the fire, his breathing shallow and labored. Duke sat beside him, alert but worried, his ears flicking nervously at every sound. The vet knelt down, his practiced hands moving gently over Rusty's side. He unwrapped the bandage, revealing the wound. The skin around it was red and swollen, a clear sign of infection. "This isn't good," Dr. Mitchell murmured. "He needs antibiotics. And soon." Emma's heart sank. "You didn't?" Dr. Mitchell shook his head. "I couldn't bring anything through the woods. It was too risky." John rubbed his face, frustration and fear boiling just beneath the surface. "What do we do, then?" The vet hesitated, glancing out the window. "There's a chance, a slim one, that the clinic still has power. If I can get back there." Emma shook her head firmly. "You just came through the forest. It's not safe. Something's out there." They all remembered the scream. Dr. Mitchell looked at Rusty, then back at them. "If we wait too long, the infection could spread. He might not make it through the night." A heavy silence filled the room, a surprising discovery. "I'll check the barn," John said suddenly, grabbing the lantern. Emma frowned. "What for?" John glanced toward the window, where the dark shape of the moose still loomed. "I don't know. I need to check." The barn was cold, the air thick with the scent of hay and animals. The cows, still jittery, watched him with wide eyes as he moved carefully through the stalls, checking for anything out of place. And then he saw it. Near the back of the barn, behind a stack of hay bales, something glinted faintly in the lantern light. He knelt down, brushing aside the straw, and his breath caught. A small, weathered wooden box, one he hadn't seen in years. Curious, he opened it, and his heart skipped a beat. Inside, carefully wrapped in cloth, were several vials of veterinary antibiotics. From years ago, when they'd had a sick calf and the vet couldn't get there in time. They'd completely forgotten about them. John stared, hardly daring to believe it. A life-saving decision. He rushed back to the house, bursting through the door with the box in his hands. "Emma, look!" She blinked in confusion. Then realization dawned as John unwrapped the vials. "Are these still good?" she whispered. Dr. Mitchell examined them, his expression shifting from disbelief to cautious hope. "They might be. If they haven't frozen or spoiled, they didn't have any other options." With gentle precision, the vet prepared an injection, the firelight casting long shadows across the room. Rusty lay still, too weak to protest as the needle slid into his side. "Now we wait," Dr. Mitchell said softly, packing away the supplies. "If we're lucky, this will buy him enough time until I can get back to the clinic." Emma knelt beside Rusty, stroking his fur, whispering to him. John stood at the window watching the moose, which still hadn't moved. "What do you want?" he whispered to the dark silhouette. The farm was quiet again, but the night wasn't over yet. Chapter 8. The Fight for Survival. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Emma sat beside Rusty, her hand gently stroking his fur. The dog barely stirred. His breathing was slow, uneven. The antibiotics had been administered, but they didn't know if they had acted in time. John paced near the window, his eyes locked on the dark figure of the moose still standing near the barn. The massive creature had not moved all night, its presence both unsettling and strangely calming. Dr. Mitchell leaned forward, listening to Rusty's heartbeat. His face remained unreadable. "Well?" Emma finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Mitchell exhaled. "His fever is high, but there's a chance. If he makes it till morning." He hesitated. "Then I think he'll pull through." Emma closed her eyes, gripping Rusty's paw. "Come on, boy. Hold on. A moose like no other." As the night stretched on, John stepped outside, needing fresh air. The cold bit into his skin, but he ignored it. Instead, he turned his attention to the moose. Something about the animal felt off. Not in a dangerous way, but in a way that stirred a deep sense of familiarity. Moving slowly, John approached. The moose twitched but didn't run. It simply watched him, its dark eyes reflecting the dim lantern light. John stopped a few feet away and, for the first time, really looked at the animal. The jagged scar along its flank, the slightly uneven stance, the way it didn't seem afraid of him. Memories surfaced. Years ago, he had rescued an orphaned moose calf after a terrible storm. It had been small and weak, barely able to stand. Emma had fed it by hand, and they had named it Birch before releasing it back into the wild. Could it be? John's breath caught. "Birch?" he whispered. The moose flicked its ears, shifting its weight but not running. John took a cautious step forward. The animal didn't flinch. "Damn," he muttered, half in awe, half in disbelief. "It's you, isn't it?" A town left in the dark. At dawn, a truck rumbled down the dirt road leading to the farm. Sam Becker, the town mechanic, leaned out the window, his face weary but hopeful. "Good news," he called. "They're working on the power. Could be back by tonight." Emma, who had been standing on the porch, gave a tired smile. "That's the best thing I've heard in days." Sam nodded but hesitated. "Bad news, too. The fire at the power station did more damage than we thought. Some folks might be without power for longer." John joined them, glancing back at the barn where the moose still stood. "We'll manage," he said. "We always do." Sam's gaze followed his. "That moose still here?" John nodded. "Yeah, and I think I know why. Helping Birch." The realization that Birch had returned after all these years left John restless. The moose wasn't just lost. It was searching for something. John grabbed his coat and made his way back to the barn. This time, Birch took a hesitant step toward him. Emma watched from the porch, her arms crossed. "Be careful." John extended a hand, palm up. The moose sniffed the air, then let out a low, soft grunt. That was all John needed. He knew that sound, it was trust. Minutes later, he found what Birch had been looking for. Near the edge of the property, tangled in a thicket of broken branches, lay another moose, a younger one, injured. "Emma," he called, "get Dr. Mitchell." A letter that changes everything. Later that evening, as Rusty stirred for the first time in hours, his fever finally breaking, Emma checked the mailbox. Among the usual letters was one from the city veterinary clinic. Confused, she opened it. Her eyes widened as she read. "What is it?" John asked, joining her. Emma handed him the letter, her hands shaking. "They're offering funding, a grant for rural animal rescue efforts. If we apply, we could get the resources we need to help animals like Birch." John read the letter twice, then looked up. A slow, knowing smile crossed his face. "Well then," he said, "looks like we've got a decision to make." Chapter 9. Light in the darkness. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and hay. Inside the house, Rusty stirred, his tail giving the faintest of wags. Emma gasped, rushing to his side. "John, come quick!" John hurried in, finding Emma on her knees, her hands cupping Rusty's face. The dog's eyes, tired but warm, met hers. He licked her fingers weakly. "He's coming back to us?" she whispered, her voice trembling with relief. Dr. Mitchell, who had been sleeping in a chair by the fire, rubbed his eyes and stood. He knelt beside them, pressing a hand to Rusty's side. "He's still weak," he said, "but he's fighting." Emma smiled through her tears. "That's our boy." Birch's departure. Outside, the moose, Birch, stood at the edge of the property, his massive frame outlined by the rising sun. He wasn't alone. John and Emma stepped onto the porch just in time to see the younger moose, injured but now standing limp toward him. "They're leaving," John murmured. Emma slipped her arm through his. "He came back for a reason, and now he's done what he needed to." Birch turned once, locking eyes with John. Then, with a slow, graceful motion, he nudged the younger moose forward, and together, they disappeared into the trees. John let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "Good luck out there, old friend." Power returns with a surprise. That afternoon, just as Emma was heating water over the fire, the lights flickered, then buzzed to life. John blinked. Well, I'll be damned. Outside, the hum of power lines returning to life filled the air. The old refrigerator whirred back into action, and the ceiling fan creaked as it started spinning again. Emma let out a laugh, wiping her hands on her apron. "I never thought I'd be this happy to hear an old fridge make noise." But just as they began celebrating, the phone rang. John exchanged a look with Emma before picking up. "John." Sam's voice was on the other end, breathless. "You need to get to town. Now." Community united. The town square was buzzing with life when they arrived. People stood in small clusters, talking in excited, relieved voices. Candles had been snuffed out, flashlights turned off. Mayor Thompson stood on the steps of the old community hall. "We've been through a rough few days," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "But we pulled through together." A cheer erupted. John and Emma found themselves surrounded by familiar faces. Neighbors, friends, even strangers who had become allies during the crisis. Sam clapped John on the back. "Heard about the moose. Looks like you've got a knack for saving lost creatures." Emma chuckled. "It's becoming a habit, an unexpected gift." Just as they were about to head home, a young woman approached. She held out a small, carefully wrapped package. Emma hesitated. "What's this?" The woman smiled. "A thank you. From all of us." John unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a wooden plaque, hand-carved with their names. Below, in elegant script, were the words, "For the kindness you give and the lives you save, human and animal alike." Emma blinked back tears. John swallowed hard. They looked at each other, then back at their town, at their home. And for the first time in days, everything felt exactly as it should. Chapter 10. Peace After the Storm. The chaos of the past days had finally begun to settle. The farm, once filled with frantic energy and urgent decisions, now hummed with a quiet peace. John stood in the garden, his hands deep in the soil, the warm sun on his back. He had always found solace in the earth, and today, the garden felt like the perfect reflection of the peace they had fought for. Emma came out with a basket full of freshly picked vegetables, her face glowing with contentment. The garden's thriving again. The corn should be ready next week, she said with a smile. John nodded, wiping his brow. It's amazing how much life can come from the chaos, from the storm, from everything that's happened. Emma joined him, setting the basket down beside a row of tomatoes. We've learned a lot, haven't we? He gave her a gentle smile. I think the biggest lesson is how much we need each other. Neighbors, animals, the land. We can't do it alone. She squeezed his hand. And we never will. The aftermath of the disaster. Though power had been restored and the crisis averted, the effects of the storm and the fire at the power station lingered. The town had suffered more than anyone realized, and the road to recovery was just beginning. The town hall had been a flurry of activity, with plans in place for rebuilding, for restoring what had been lost. Sam Becker had even organized a work crew to repair the damage to the farm's fence. Everyone was pitching in, working side by side to mend what had been broken. John felt a deep sense of gratitude for his community, and, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't worried about what was coming next. The town was resilient. They had all learned what it meant to face hardship and emerge stronger on the other side. Now it was time for rebuilding. Not just buildings, but bonds, relationships, and lives. Rusty runs again. Inside the house, Emma heard the familiar sound of paws pattering against the floor. She looked up just in time to see Rusty bounding through the door, his tail wagging in wide circles. "Look at you!" she exclaimed, her voice full of joy as she dropped to her knees to greet him. John came inside just as Rusty jumped into Emma's arms, licking her face with playful energy. "He's back," John said softly, watching the dog's joyful movements. "He's really back." Emma laughed, holding Rusty tightly. It's like nothing ever happened. For a moment, it felt as though time had turned back. The fear, the uncertainty. It all seemed like a distant memory now. But they knew, deep down, that the journey they had taken together had changed them all, especially Rusty. The bond between them was stronger than ever, forged in the fires of hardship and now tempered by healing. The moose story, later that afternoon, as John and Emma sat on the porch, enjoying a rare moment of stillness, a few of their neighbors came over. Sam and his wife, Marnie, sat down beside them, with warm cups of coffee in hand. "You won't believe what we heard today," Sam said, a grin spreading across his face. "What?" John asked, raising an eyebrow. "The moose," Marnie replied. "We talked to old Missy at the market. She says that the moose you saw, the one that came back, well, she says he was a guardian spirit, that he only comes when the farm's in danger, to protect it." John and Emma exchanged a curious glance. "A guardian spirit?" Emma echoed. Sam nodded. "Missy swears by it. She says the moose comes when the land or the people need help, and when he leaves, things settle back into balance." John shook his head, a smile playing at his lips. "Well, if that's true, I guess he did his job. I don't care what she says," Marnie added with a chuckle. "All I know is that if Birch ever shows up again, I'll be sure to leave him a thank you gift." They all laughed, the tension of the past few days finally slipping away. Sunset over the farm. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden hue across the farm, John and Emma sat on the porch, watching the world around them come alive with the colors of twilight. The air was cooler now, the rustling of the leaves in the trees creating a soothing rhythm. Rusty lay at their feet, exhausted from his running, his head resting comfortably on his paws. "I don't think I've ever seen a sunset quite like this one," Emma said, her voice soft and reflective. John smiled, his arm around her shoulders. "It's perfect, peaceful." She leaned into him, closing her eyes. "After everything we've been through, it's nice to just have a moment of quiet." As the stars began to twinkle in the sky above them, they both knew that whatever the future held, they were ready. The farm had survived. Their family had survived. And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of their home and the love of the land, they knew they would continue to thrive together.